All right, welcome to Homework 2D. This video is going to be a little shorter than the other videos just because the content is a little bit more compact in this unit's topics. So 2.12 and on, this will be the end of Unit 2. So we're going to talk about the bureaucracy. So the bureaucracy is sometimes referred to as like the fourth branch or another extension of the government, but it really is actually under the executive branch. Bureaucracy means rule by office, okay? And so what this is how we enforce laws through governmental agencies. And so that's going to take the form of 4 different things: departments, agencies, commissions, and offices. And basically what this is all of the people who make the government work other than the branches. So if you say someone is like a government employee, that's what they mean, is they're part of the bureaucracy. So Department of Transportation, Department of Education, Department of Agriculture, all of those people, or all of those organizations have workers under them who fill out the paperwork, put out the grants under fiscal federalism. They, write citations for emissions violations in the EPA, right? So they're the ones who are actually doing the work of government. They implement policy, they enforce it. And so that's why they're considered a part of the executive branch, right? Now, the president is kind of like their boss, sort of, and they do a few things. Number one is they write and enforce regulations. What this means is, for example, if there is a law that says that under the FDA, they make a rule that says that milk has to be good for 2 weeks after selling, right? And if it spoils before those 2 weeks, that's against the rules, right, to avoid spoiled milk. And so they get a report that a grocery store is selling spoiled milk, and it's been on the shelves for 2 days and it's already spoiled. They might go out there and either write, effectively a fine or a punishment, or tell them they need to fix something, right? And so they're going to enforce that regulation. They might issue a fine. That's a pretty common thing in the bureaucracy. The Department of Education will do this with schools that are not meeting criteria. They might pull funding too. The other thing to keep in mind are iron triangles. We'll talk about that in just a second. And then issue networks. Issue networks are going to be organizations working with non-governmental agencies that have the same priorities. So the ATF and the NRA, for example. And again, we'll talk more about that in just a minute. And then the merit system versus the spoils system. Something to keep in mind with the bureaucracy is that it used to be based on the spoils system, which it comes from this phrase called to the victor go the spoils. And all it means is the person who wins gets the prize. And how that applies to this is the fact that it used to be that when the president was elected, he would get to appoint all of his friends into the bureaucracy, right? And so all of his friends would get government jobs. Well, the problem with that, if you couldn't tell, is that sometimes that would work, but sometimes he would be appointing people who are completely and wildly unqualified. Andrew Jackson was famous for this. And so he would just appoint people who had donated to his campaign with no qualifications and no consideration for their effectiveness at the job. And so the merit system, it replaced that when we included things like the Pendleton Civil Service Act. And basically now we have more of a system that says you can't work for the government unless you are qualified for the job. Now let's get into iron triangles. Sorry, you can't see me here. But basically this is just the idea that there is a 3-way relationship between Congress, interest groups, and bureaucracy, right? Congress, bureaucracy, and interest groups almost work like the branches of government in their own little checks and balances system. So Congress can fund the bureaucracy, but in exchange, the bureaucracy will help enforce their policies. Congress can help pass laws to help interest groups, for example, looser gun restrictions for the NRA. And in exchange, the NRA will help Congress get elected again. And then interest groups and bureaucracy will work together. The bureaucracy will maybe be looser on their regulations and do favors for those interest groups. And in return, interest groups will support them via lobbying. So that's definitely a relationship that you need to study and be able to know those checks both directions. And that leads us to discretionary and rulemaking authority. This is the idea that the bureaucracy can actually sort of make laws. And by that, we mean that Congress can delegate some of its power to the bureaucracy. For example, The Department of Transportation has rules for emissions on trucks and cars. Basically, this means that cars can't be putting out all this smog, right? There's limits on how much pollution each car can make. Now, Congress has said we need to have emissions regulations. Department of Transportation, you make the rules. Department of Transportation will take that and make rules saying trucks can do this much, cars can make this much, hybrids and electric vehicles can make this much, right? And then they enforce them. And so that can be controversial sometimes because in theory, Congress makes laws, right? Congress has legislative authority under Article 1 of the Constitution. Bureaucracy is part of the executive branch. They enforce the laws. So should they be able to make rules and regulations, people disagree on the extent to which they should be able to do that. Some agencies to know, you don't need to be able to name all like 60-something agencies. There's so many of them. There's actually over 100 if you include like random commissions and boards and things like that. There's so many agencies. But the ones that you need to know and be able to kind of explain should an FRQ come up on the bureaucracy, which it has before. Department of Homeland Security. This is going to be anything where we are defending our country from foreign threats, not necessarily wars, although that too. A lot of times this includes like immigration. Department of Transportation, like I said, this is a pretty common one when it comes to FRQs. They will use this as an example. Department of Veterans Affairs. So, for example, the VA will set its own rules on what counts as a disabled veteran, right? That's not really a law necessarily, although there are laws about that. But there are regulations in place about how that's carried out based on the VA. They make that rule. The Department of Education, right? So, for example, we're having a very big debate right now about school vouchers. And so that's a state issue, but this is a department that has made rules and regulations that have been created by Congress, but the Department of Education is who's, in Texas anyway, is who's creating the specifics around that. The Environmental Protection Agency, which is the EPA, and the Federal Elections Commission, which we will actually be doing a court case about next unit. Oh, and then the Securities Exchange Commission. This is who rules investment in Wall Street, basically making sure that's not a corrupt system. Speaking of corrupt system, 2.14 is about holding the bureaucracy accountable. And so there is a benefit to bureaucracy in that iron triangle, right? In that they can effectively check Congress in another way. They provide what's called congressional oversight, which means that they look over Congress's rules. They review, monitor, and supervise their laws. But in exchange, Congress can also have oversight on bureaucracy. And so that can take the form of investigations, committee hearings. They can be sanctioned, which means they get like a note in their file, basically, and then they might get punished. So like lack of funding. So the Congress has the power of the purse, right? Which means their budget, and so they could pull funding from the Department of Transportation should they be not following the rules. Okay. And so this is a huge check from the legislative branch on executive power. However, the president influences how bureaucracy functions. A lot of times this is going to take the form of an executive order. When we talk about executive orders, and we talked about this in class the other day in the Fab Lab, that basically we are checking executive power by the legislature. But that the president has a lot of direct control on the bureaucracy through executive orders. And so he can make rules about how the military functions, how the departments function, right? And then compliance monitoring. Basically, there are committees in Congress as well as non-governmental organizations, so like interest groups that will like basically be watchdogs for the bureaucracy, making sure they are following the rules. Okay, and so then the last thing to keep in mind is just 2.15 is more of like an application piece, but basically it's just the idea that the formal and informal powers of Congress and the president, as well as the courts can rule bureaucratic actions unconstitutional, as well as the executive orders that rule bureaucracy unconstitutional. And then the other thing about the iron triangle to keep in mind is that there are multiple access points for stakeholders and institutions to influence public policy, which just means the more ways that there are for people to get involved, the less likely it is to become corrupt. So if there's one guy at the top, a la King George, right? Well, you can't really go schedule a meeting with King George, right? But if there are multiple stakeholders and multiple ways for stakeholders to be involved and multiple access points is what we call them, so ways to be involved in the government. Sure, I guess you could write a letter to the president, but you could also contact the department that is ruling whatever you have an issue with, right? If you're mad about emissions rules, well, you could, in theory, go to the Department of Transportation and talk to them about it. You could get involved with an interest group and lobby for new legislation to change that. And so that sharing of powers limits the power of each of those individual actors and serves as this natural system of checks and balances. Okay. So that is all I have for you today, and I will see you next time.